Hello and welcome to the February Patreon Q&A video here on Three Skulls Tavern. A little short announcement just before I launch into this one. I'm probably going to be putting my Patreon on hold for a little while, and so that means this might be the last Patreon Q&A for a while. I might be changing things up with regards to Patreon and how I interact with the community in future, but for now, don't expect another one of these Q&As for at least a few months. Yeah. Anyway, with that out of the way, there are only two questions this month from my Q&A, and they're both relatively meaty, so I'm kind of excited to get into them. And yeah, the first one is about GMing advice, specifically for sandboxes, and the second one is more of a game designer question. So the first question is from Peter, and it says, I'm currently almost finished preparing a Sea of Claws sandbox for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. For those of you who don't know, Sea of Claws is an expansion for the 4th edition of WFRP, and it involves the northern sea region of the Empire. Kind of covers the northern coast of Nordland, and also between, like, just north of that, there is the I guess the southern coast of the kind of northern region where there's a lot of kind of chaos Vikings, basically. Anyway, the campaign themes are change, powerlessness, returns, poverty, and tradition. What might make some interesting questions to pose to players to help them develop their characters? Beyond, where are you from? What's your greatest flaw? What would you like to engage? Sorry, what would you like to change? Is a Sea of Claws sandbox the right place to give characters connections to NPCs like children and partners? So there's a lot of stuff in here to unpack. I guess I'm going to tackle that first question first. Let's look at the themes. The themes are change, powerlessness, returns, poverty, and tradition. Just talking about returns and tradition, and knowing that the campaign is probably going to be about voyages on the sea, I do think that having connections to NPCs like children and partners is probably a good idea. I've also been reading a lot of Joe Abercrombie lately, and I'm currently nearly finished with the heroes. And the heroes, a big theme of that is people going out to, are northerners at war in a big army, and a lot of them are kind of getting sick of it, and they want to return back home to their families to do the plowing, to return to their wives and children, etc., or husbands for some of them too. So from my perspective, yeah, I definitely think there's a place for that if you want to include it as a theme in this. It basically gives the characters a little bit more depth and a reason to not necessarily just be out adventuring. But again, it needs to fit in with your campaign themes, which I'm not 100% sure exactly what those are going to be. Kind of relates to the characters as well, how they build those characters. And if they do build kind of family backgrounds into their characters and it becomes relevant, then absolutely they should be explored. And there should be connections to them. If you're gonna make the connections and they're never really going to be explored, or they're going to be relevant to the campaign, then there's no point in doing that. Of course, you probably know that already. Yeah. So the one thing I want to talk about with this, when I talk about interesting questions to pose, I want to look back at what I did for my Imperium Maledictum campaign, which is a sandbox campaign. And what I did is, for session 0, I introduced a Q&A, a questionnaire with 10 questions that I posed to the players. And I'm actually going to flash that up on screen right now. And this is basically, I made this in a Google Slides, which is basically like PowerPoint for Google, and went through it with them. In fact, there's a video of my session 0, which I did publish on the channel, where we kind of walk through this in like a course of an hour or so. So this is what I recommend doing. And so the first thing I did is I gave some campaign notes where I kind of talked about, following our initial character creation steps, kind of summarized it all here. This is mainly for the audience. You wouldn't necessarily need to do this for your own group. And then the questions. So I'm just going to rattle through the questions. But the one thing to note here is that I included multiple choice options. So if the players wanted to pick one option, they were free. That was like the recommendation, was pick one of these options, or come up with something similar for yourself. And if you kind of wanted one of those options, but you weren't sure which one you wanted, then you could roll a d10 and that would randomly select one of them. So this wasn't just posing them questions like the book did and say, here's some 10 questions to think about. I was kind of leading them on. And this is a big point to make here, is by coming up with the answers to these questions yourself, you're able to direct the themes for the campaign that your players are going to kind of latch onto. Because in my experience, if you do this as a group activity in session 1, most of your players, for about 90% of the time, they're going to select one of the options that you've put down for them. They're going to be put on the spot to a certain extent. They're not necessarily going to come up with their own answers unless it's really clear to them, because they already have a very clear idea of their backstory. So this would be my recommendation. I'll include a link to this presentation, to these slides in the video. So if you want to grab it, feel free to go and steal as much of this as you want. I did write all of these down myself, so this isn't something I kind of pinched from other areas. It did take me a few hours in prep to come up with the answers for these slides, but in my opinion, it was prep that was definitely worth it, because it helped not only give the characters a more detailed backstory, it gave them a detailed backstory that I was able to influence to help me make the campaign more relevant to them, which I think you need to do in a sandbox, or it's important for a sandbox, because it gives the players hooks into it, and it gives them an immediate sense of relevance to the story that you're kind of sharing and telling together. And for a GM, obviously, it gives you a lot of meat in terms of what motivates those players, or the characters, I should say, and what direction you might want to take their campaign. So the first one was talking about, their family. So do they have any connections to family? Because that might be relevant. In the end, it didn't really become very relevant to mine, but this is what I would recommend doing something similar for your campaign. So, not just who is your family, but what do you consider family? So, it might be a lover, it might be an actual family member, it could be a comrade, or it might be they're just like a lone wolf. The second question was, what do you believe in? So this also, another big reason for this specific questionnaire is one of my players had very little experience with the 40K setting. So I was able to give them a flavor of the setting just by going through the questions of this questionnaire. But basically asking what they believe in also gives them, in a way, some built-in goals or motivations, which can be important later on. So these are very specific to 40K. You wouldn't necessarily use these for 4th edition of WFRP, specifically not a Sea of Claws one, but some ideas anyway to think about. Going on from beliefs to motivations. Now, these you could very well tweak a little bit to be relevant to 4th edition. These are going to help with the short-term and long-term goals, theoretically, which is a big part of 4th edition. So I would definitely have a think about putting this in. Don't label it as goals. Having a motivation is going to help them to think about what their goals might be, both short-term and long-term. So I definitely recommend doing something like motivations. Fear, there is a fear mechanic in Imperium Maledictum, and I wanted to have the players have to face their fears at some point. I did do that in the campaign, and I'm glad I did it. Whereas if we hadn't have touched on this, I don't think the players would have even thought about what they were afraid of. So this gave me a way to kind of poke at some of the minor. It didn't really come across as like a horror theme to it, but it does. Having characters face their fears is a very powerful narrative device, and I think it's something I would recommend at least thinking about. So I think this is worth including, something like this. And you did talk about helplessness as the theme, and knowing what the characters are afraid of allows you to really focus on that helplessness as a theme. And in fact, I would probably tweak this list to include things that are going to help with helplessness. So kind of here I kind of talk about things like, the Inquisition, and exposure to something. But you can really tweak this around to be a bit more psychological fears rather than external things that might be afraid of. What do they do in their free time? This was just for a bit of flavor in terms of like fleshing the characters out to think of like, what are your interests? That could be quite interesting for being, if it's ship based, what is your role on the ship? Something along those lines. So it makes them feel like they're part of a crew a bit more. Your closest ally, this was to tie them into the setting of Necromunda a little bit more. You could come up with a list of NPCs on the ship and do something similar and have a little blurb for like 10 or 5 to 10 different NPCs on the ship. Who's your closest ally on the ship, and that's going to tie them closer together as a crew, make them feel like they're part of the ship a bit more. How did the two players meet each other in my case, but how did the players know each other? So this is something you could think about, tying them together as a group. what was their first mission together, or if they've been together on the ship, what was their first voyage? Like, give them some options for what their voyage might have entailed. This was specifically because they were guild like freelancers, so not just what their first mission together was, because that could have been anything, but then when they actually got involved with the guilds, this is very specific to the campaign. I wouldn't necessarily have both of these in yours. And the last one was a connection to your patron, because patrons are a big part of the Imperium Maledictum setting. So those were the 10 questions. I would recommend doing something similar, and I would recommend coming up with questions that have to do with your themes. So we talked about, well, I said helplessness, you talked about powerlessness, but those are kind of two sides of the same coin. And I think by touching on the player's fears, I think that's something that you really, really need to be looking at. Motivations, I think, is important because of the mechanic in 4th edition of short and long-term goals. That's a way for them to earn additional experience points, and I think it's sometimes hard to think of those. And by being able to influence their short and long-term goals by giving them motivations that are relevant to your campaign, I think that's something I would not avoid either. Change is a hard one because change can mean all sorts of different things. So in terms of what specific types of change you're thinking about, maybe think of some questions along those lines. It could be things like physical or psychological change in terms of mutation. So looking at the psychological mechanics in 4th edition, maybe come up with, how do they view mutants? That could be a relevant question. If it's other types of change, it really depends on the type of change. Maybe reach out to me in Discord if there's something specific you're thinking about, and maybe I can give some advice for questions there. Returns. Again, if I'm thinking about this very much in terms of like a voyage type campaign. If you want to think about them returning home, then having family, or even asking the question, what do you return to in between villages, could be a good one. And have an option for family, have an option for something else, like I don't know, like think of things that might be relevant to the Warhammer universe or the Warhammer fantasy setting, and maybe pitch it like that, like what are you looking forward to returning to between every voyage, something like that. And that gives them a little bit of depth to their characters beyond just the adventuring moments, assuming that downtime might be like between voyages, for example. Poverty. Really easy to influence that with these questions. And I mean, this is where you would kind of maybe give 1 or 2 loaded questions in terms of, what's your most prized possession, and have them be really shitty, like inexpensive things that are really emphasizing that you're not a hero loaded down with like some magical artifact. You're a sailor on a ship, and your most prized possession is your violin, like your beaten hand-me-down violin that was given to you. It used to be your grandfather's, and he pilfered it off of some like pirating campaign or something, right? So I think that's where you can really lean into the poverty aspect by loading questions like that, or asking things like, what do you consider a great treasure? And not have it be things like, magical artifacts and things like that, but be things like more working class sort of ideals, things that are a bit more within reach for people who are effectively sailors or whatever. And that's going to really also help influence your potentially influence those short-term and long-term goals as well, rather than being things like, I want to have 1,000 gold coins or something, right? If you want poverty to be a big theme, then, and I'm assuming you mean in respects to the player characters as well, then make sure you're getting the players to think about that for their own characters as well. And tradition, again, really easy to influence with multiple choice questions. I mean, I would probably, I wouldn't necessarily go down like traditions, but maybe it's things like, you could do things like, if it's a shipboard culture, you could ask questions like, how do you pass the time on a voyage? or, it's kind of like the down, like, what do you do in your free time? That was the thing I had. It could be something like that. And you could give a list of things that happen on the ship that are basically part of the ship's culture. So just by reading through the list, they're getting a flavor for what the campaign's going to be about. And in terms of the wider setting, you could theoretically include like a superstition, a list like, what are you superstitious of? And have 10 related things. They could even be nautical superstitions that might help tie it in. And by just doing something like that, I think you can really very easily tie in the themes that you want for your campaign to the players, to their backgrounds, and make it all relevant. But the key to that is, I think, in my opinion, is spending a few hours coming up with a list of questions like this, by giving loaded answers that are effectively giving the flavor of the campaign to the players, and making them pick an option that is going to basically help keep their players relevant and make the themes relevant. So it is unfortunately some prep that is needed from a GM side. It's not something you can just kind of do on the fly, in my opinion, but I think it really helps with a sandbox campaign to give a lot of player agency and relevance to the campaign. So that's my opinion. That's what I would do, and I hope that answers your question. All right, thanks, Peter. Our second question comes from Kobiak, and it's a meaty one. Free League just announced the new sci-fi game Coriolis the Great Dark. And by the way, I did do a reaction video to that earlier today. I'll be uploading that before this video. So in fact, if you look up here, there will be a little card showing you that reaction video. So go check that out if you haven't already, if you are interested in my opinions on what's been announced so far of the second edition of Coriolis. Anyway, Kobiak goes on to say, the blurb describes it as a game of exploration and a game about hope and enduring against all odds. What are your thoughts about the chances of an indie designer using the Year Zero engine to design a game that sounds somewhat familiar? Is there space for both? I know you shelved your plans for releasing a zombie game when The Walking Dead was announced. When Free League announces a new game, is it game over for indie Year Zero engine designers with similar game concepts? Or lies their hope in attracting other buyers or gamers that are not deeply into the Year Zero engine ecosystem of games? Bit of context then. I was working on a game which at the time the project name was Kentucky Zombie Apocalypse. I had done lots of playtesting of it. It was using the alien stress die mechanic, and I knew nothing about The Walking Dead that it was coming out. And basically, I had a full rule set written for this game and everything. And then The Walking Dead was announced. And The Walking Dead used an alien stress die mechanic. In fact, a better implementation than what I was coming up with. And it completely scuppered my plans for that game, as Kobiak is aware. And as a result, I did think about how I might be able to salvage some of what I'd worked on with Kentucky Zombie Apocalypse and maybe release something similar. But at the moment, that's not happening. I have completely shelved that project. I was thinking about taking it forward, Kentucky Zombie Apocalypse, as a solo-only game. But then after I had thought about that, I ended up being the official solo rule set writer, author for The Walking Dead. And I had such a blast writing that I kind of scratched that itch. So while I do think there is space for me to come back to Kentucky Zombie Apocalypse in the future, I would definitely not be looking to do something similar to The Walking Dead. I would be tackling it from a different approach. So Kobiak is asking this because I know Kobiak has been developing his own sci-fi Year Zero engine game with themes of exploration, and so he's in a similar boat that I was with The Walking Dead. And really, I think there can be space for both, but what you have to be very careful of is if you don't adapt to what Free League has released, if they're too similar, there's probably going to be very, very little, like, people are probably not going to end up being interested in your game, because why go for an indie game when there's this effectively like AAA version of it with really high production values, artwork, which frankly us indie developers are not going to be able to match. So what you have to do is you have to approach it, in my opinion, from a different angle. So that's what I'll be doing with The Walking Dead, with my Kentucky Zombie Apocalypse. The Walking Dead specifically focuses in on the social aspects of the zombie apocalypse and doesn't really go very far at all into the survival aspects. So for mine, that's probably what I would do, is I would make it less abstract, make it more more about survival, and that's the direction I would take it. There are actually some like fully released workshop titles that use Twilight 2000 as a zombie apocalypse game, which if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out. I'm not going to put... I'm not actually a big fan of Twilight 2000 because it's a huge amount of crunch. But it does mean that you get can really lean very deeply into the survival aspects of an apocalypse game. So if that's kind of more your direction, then go check those out. Reach out to me in the comments if you want a link, and I can look it up and I can respond in the comments. So if that's something you're looking for a link, check the comments out. If there isn't one, ask and I'll look it up and respond there. But yeah, anyway, I don't want to focus too much on The Walking Dead. To answer the question here, it doesn't have to be game over. I think the important thing is, as I said, focus on an aspect of your game that is different to the officially announced game. If exactly what you're working on, then I think it is game over. You could change the mechanics to not be the Year Zero engine, but then you're still competing with Free League on a very similar concept, and you're never going to be able, as an indie designer, to really compete with not just Free League, but any of the big publishers, in my opinion. So you might attract people who don't like the Year Zero engine. There are people who don't like the Free League's engine, and so by doing something with a different core mechanic, maybe you'll attract some people. But really, I wouldn't personally find it to be worth the effort to do that. So I would definitely focus on providing a similar kind of game, but with very different themes. Look at, for example, Coriolis and Alien. They are both about space. Some of them, there are some themes. They're not just sci-fi. There are themes of like exploration and other things, but they differ between themselves by one being very much about space horror and the other one being about, well, now this new one is going to be about exploration. So they can kind of exist in the same space by the same publisher and be scratching different itches, even though they're both sci-fi games. And a lot of the mechanics are kind of shared between them, like the space combat, for example. Ship combat is very, very, very similar between the two games. So I think in those respects you can have something similar, but it's very, very much necessary that you focus on themes and don't worry about mechanics, but themes. What is your game about? And make it something that's different to the one that Free League have done. And then your mechanics need to kind of be in service to those themes. So yeah, I kind of touching on, I don't want to go too deep down the game design rabbit hole, but in my opinion, when you're starting to think about creating a game, you have a concept that kind of is where you start with. And the very next thing you should start with after that is your themes. What is your game about? And before you start thinking of any mechanics, that's what you need to focus on and really hone in on. What is my game about? What are the main themes? How is everything that I come up with going here forward in service to making those themes come across in the game? And if you need to change those themes, then you're almost going back to the starting point, although theoretically some of those themes should already be in place, but you might need to tweak those starting themes a bit and almost go back to page one and revisit your initial game from a slightly different perspective. Yeah. And the other thing I think is really important, if this happens, put your game to one side for at least a month or two, because time will really help with you approach time is a really great way in the kind of creative process to take a step back and come back to it later with a fresh set of eyes. I do this myself, and it's always been helpful. And what I would do here is I would actually go back to your themes. I would think about initially, as soon as the game has been announced, look at how you might want to change the direction of your game. Come up with those different themes that you want to be focusing on, and then I would just park the project for a month or two. Wait until you've got access to the quick start or the alpha for this new Free League game. Have a look at it so you know exactly what that game is going to be about, how they're implementing the mechanics and stuff. then leave it again like another at least I would say a month after that. So you've got time for things to percolate in your brain a little bit. Go back to your original project, look at those themes, armed with a knowledge of what Free League are doing with their game, and then think about how start the game design process about how you implement those themes in your game, whilst also in the back of your brain knowing how Free League are doing it and trying to keep your game feeling fresh and different to that. So yeah, that's what I would do. Hopefully that's of some use to you, Kobiak. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. Anyway, that's it for this month. And as I said at the beginning, there's not likely to be another Q&A for a while. If there is in the future, it might even be taking might have a different format. We'll just have to wait and see. There are going to be some big changes on the channel, basically because of some project work that's come my way very recently. So I'll talk more about that in a future video as well. But for now, thanks very much, and catch you in the next episode or the next video. Cheers.